adding to what Tomer was saying, Dr. Ross, it seems like this system is completely unsustainable. It seems like this is something that this is not a solid foundation for society to move forward on. So what's your take on that?
Well, for sure, right? We know from history that all fiat currency eventually goes to zero, right? Governments they can't resist the temptation to debase their currency. And when they do that, what they're doing is just stealing purchasing power from their citizens, right? Everybody knows that. Although, well, I should say, all Bitcoiners know that, and people who understand money know that, and the people who control money know that. But the vast majority of Americans still don't know that. So what happens is they can't resist. Purchasing power continues to decline over time. When we have this Keynesian credit-based economic system, you have to have inflation. You have to continue to grow your credit base because you're constantly just rolling over your debt and rolling over your debt and compounding and compounding and compounding. That's what we call the debt spiral, which eventually turns into a death spiral for the underlying currency, right? So it continues until basically people are like, I don't want your fiat currency anymore because it's basically worthless. Why would I continue to get paid in this currency that costs you nothing to make, but you're giving that to me as payment? Eventually what happens is people lose confidence in that currency and it goes to zero. And that's literally 100% of the time with fiat currencies, you go to zero. So I have no doubt in my mind that all of the current government fiat currencies are going to go to zero. Not in my lifetime necessarily. They could. Um, but I do think the dollar, it's the strong, it's the best crack house on the crack street, as Foss would say, or something like that. And it is, right. It's the strongest fiat currency. It has the strongest military in the world behind it. They have this sweetheart deal with the rest of the world where you buy our bonds and you'll fund our military whether you want to or not, and we'll basically provide worldwide military service for you, for us though. And so we get to export our inflation to the nations, and we get to enjoy lots of the benefits. That, people have been calling for the demise of the dollar for a long time. It's not going down anytime soon, but I do believe with my whole heart that it is going down eventually. And it's one of the laws. It's almost like a law of physics, right? Things you can count on: death and taxes. You can also count on fiat debasement, but you can also count on Bitcoin deflation, right? So growth of purchasing power over time, and it's just the mechanics, it's the math behind the system. So like we were talking about, coming full circle, why do we blather on about why do I talk about Powell? Well, in the central banks, and what is the Fed doing? Unfortunately we have to, because in 2008 2009 the Fed wrested control of the risk markets from the underlying economy almost completely, and it's now based on monetary decisions and fiscal decisions, and not necessarily on what the economy is doing underneath it. And that's not just true in the US, it's true with all of the major economies around the world. And so, all of our governments have spending problems. The central bankers and Powell and the Fed, they get a lot of flack, and they should, but it's actually not their fault per se. It's actually the fault of governments that just cannot stop spending. The governments spend and they spend and they spend and they create debt. And if nobody is willing to buy that crappy debt that's actually losing purchasing power to inflation over time, the Fed is the buyer of last resort of these treasuries. So that's the purpose of these central banks, is to be the buyer of last resorts of the government's debt. And so they're very intricately linked. So what's the end? This is a really long answer to your question. The end is zero. The dollar is going to zero. All fiat currency is going to zero. Again, I'm not saying that it's happening this year or next year, but it is happening in some government fiat currencies, right? We were watching it in real time in Lebanon, Argentina. You can see lots of countries that are struggling around the world. One by one, they're going to figure out that, hey, we actually have a viable alternative. It's as accessible as the internet is. It's called Bitcoin, and this can actually save us from our governments. And then the final thing is, and then we'll go back to Tomer. Whoever controls the money has the power, right? We all grew up knowing the adage, money is power. So the makers of the money and the controllers of the money have all the power. Governments have all the power. The US government is the most powerful nation state in the world, in the history of the world, because of the monetary policies that we've had since basically, post World War II. We don't want to give up that exorbitant privilege. It's a huge privilege. It's a huge benefit to Americans as well. And so,
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, you said we would transition, so I want to point out that privilege comes at a big cost. And again, when we say we, the people who've paid a very dear price for that privilege is the American middle class, the American working class, the American union worker, all of those people. Because what happened when we went off the gold, when the world went off the gold standard, and America, and this is Peter Zahan's original thesis, right? That America became the superpower, protected the shipping ways, gave everyone access to their economy. And when we went off the gold standard, basically America exported protecting military protection of importing stuff made abroad into America in exchange for US dollars, which secured the world and prevented wars as long as you accepted it. If you didn't accept the US dollar, war somehow came to you. But peace came to you in the form of military bases and ships, naval ships to protect your goods to be shipped into America. But as that happened, and this was a long, slow shift, Nico's too young to remember it. I don't know how old you are, Dr. Jeff. I'm probably a little bit older than you. And people older than me remember even a time when there were like no imported cars on the roads. And what this led to was everyone who had US dollars in the US basically buying goods that were made abroad and shipped and imported into America. And that led to the erosion of most manufacturing, like a lot of manufacturing jobs. Not your house can't be imported, so real estate, house building is still done locally, but many components are now imported, and certainly just about this computer I'm talking to you on was made and manufactured, assembled in China, even though it was designed by an American company. And just about everything that I'm looking at, this piece of assembled furniture that it sits on, I did the assembly work, not an American paid worker, but a Chinese factory assembled it. And so what happened is we hollowed out the middle class, and they're the ones paying the price today, right? They're the number of people who are in the middle class, or the amount of income. The middle class used to represent something like 60% of all the income, and now it's under 40%. So like a full third roughly of the income that the middle class had is no longer middle class income. And you go to WTFhappened in 1971.com, you can see where it all went. It went to the very, very top elite. So we've paid this big price for this privilege that isn't a privilege that all Americans benefit from, or all North Americans or all Westerners benefit from. It's a privilege that the elite class doesn't. And many of us are in that elite class. We're service workers, we're executives, we're lawyers, we're professionals who haven't lost their share of the income as a result. But this is, there we go. There's an interesting chart, right? 1971. Thank you for sharing this, whoever is doing that magic. Worker productivity has gone up by 150% to from 100 to 250, but worker compensation has hardly budged. So all that productivity, all that increase has gone somewhere else. And there's lots of other charts along these lines that people can check there, or do your own research. You don't have to do too much research. The number of people employed by unions who worked for people to have pensions. Nobody's getting a pension anymore nowadays. Who worked for people to have safe working conditions, all this kind of stuff. Like that's dropped dramatically. And most importantly, right, it's in the private sector, it's dropped off profoundly, right? Like in the government sector, well, government, union, those kind of things end up working together. People work together, but they're providing service work, right? And so they're not building things. So we've just had this hollowing out of our ability. And like some of this knowledge is lost to the point where we don't have it anymore. Like we can't just tomorrow fire up all sorts of factories. We have to learn how to fire up factories. We have to learn how to make things. And things are made the way that they're made abroad. The reliable, durable, unbreakable kind of appliances that we used to have, they don't exist anymore. Everything's built to be as cheap and breakable as possible. I'll just like one final anecdote. Part of this was seen through the Walmartization of retail, right? Big box retail, where the intention was, and again, these good intentions, right? Like the intention was so that ordinary folks could afford the nice things that wealthy people could have. But that came by making slave labor overseas produce those things for what we called ordinary folks, who now are finding themselves buying much lower quality things than they ever imagined. They would, and have a bleak outlook for
Yep.
their future. So it's kind of the pivot point. I just want to say the pivot point that we stand at is this continues, and we end up with a very bifurcated West, right? With people who have elite access to things. Manufacturing doesn't serve the masses anymore. It's just we just build fancy yachts for the ultra rich, and other people eat garbage. Or we find the pivot point, which is the masses get sound money and use sound money and don't get exploited by all the things that are broken with the dollar, right? The dollar isn't just the elite have the privilege of printing it and keeping it for themselves. It's like, well, we use it. We all collectively fell into the fallacy of using it to buy cheap foreign products. So look at all the stuff I filled my house with, but I was filling it with lost jobs, lost North American jobs, and lost quality of North American manufacturing. Some people would argue it wasn't high quality enough, but it's like anything old in your house and anything new in your house, you can see the difference, right? One's made of plywood and stickers, and something else is made out of an actual piece of wood or piece of metal that's solid and not the minimum thickness it needs to be able to be assembled before it collapses.